Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Podcast. Joining me today is Nicole Foley. Nicole and I are going to be diving into Olympic weightlifting. So we're going to talk about and break down the clean and clean variations, the snatch and snatch variations, accessories, and so many other considerations around Olympic weightlifting. This episode and every episode in season 5 is sponsored by ISOFIT. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training and a great way to help you and your athletes win more and hurt less. For more on ISOFIT, you can check out the description below. Enjoy. Nicole, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thank you so much for being here and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and chop it up with some Olympic weightlifting.
Yeah, and for people who maybe haven't heard of you or all the incredible stuff you and the team at Rude Rock have been doing, could you fill them in a little bit about who you are and what you've been up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I feel like I wear a lot of different hats, but I'm a business owner. I'm a mom. I'm a coach. I was a former dancer turned Olympic weightlifter. And right now, my main focus and my main priority is running the business side of Rude Rock. So I am doing all of the behind the scenes stuff. And for people that might not know, although at this point I feel like they should, I think you've had almost all of our coaches on so far. But we're a human performance company that specializes in injury restoration and return to play for athletic populations. And right now, I am the big brain behind it all, not the intellectual big brain. Should delineate. I make all of the operations run. Um, I'm in charge of website and managing coaches and all of our processes and procedures, marketing, things like that, that allow Danny, Jeremy, Chipper, Kyla, and Luke to go out there and do what they do best, and that's work with athletes and help get them back on the field, on the court, and just feeling good, moving through their sport.
Yeah, that's amazing. You certainly do a lot of different things there with Rude Rock, and then on top of it with Layla, with the dogs, and so on that way. And somehow within all of that, you still find time to train as well, which I really respect.
Thank
I'd imagine it was a little difficult for a while there. I don't know when y'all sleep or how much caffeine you go through as like a household, but it seems like you've really stayed consistent with things.
I've tried to. I've definitely tried to. It looks a lot different, I will say, than it did prior to having Layla. You know, pre-baby, I had time to, dedicate a 92-hour minute training session whenever I wanted, and I could, manipulate it around my work schedule, and it wasn't as much of an issue. Now I have to be a little bit more mindful of not only my time and my time management, but, you know, having a 2-hour training session when I could be spending, time hanging out with my daughter. Like, priorities have shifted a little bit, but training is still very much a priority. So I feel like I've found a good way to manage both of those to allow me to continue to do what I love. One, because I love it and I enjoy it, but two, for my own mental and physical health. But then to also be able to spend time with her and have the opportunity to, be a mom and be with her, like, that's just as important to me. So it's definitely been different, that's for sure. But having kind of that foundation and like love of lifting prior to having her has really helped me stay consistent, because I not only recognize how important it is for me to train, but I've just had those, I had that as, such a staple in my life to begin with. Bringing her into the mix, it was like, okay, we just need to shuffle some things around rather than trying to add in something new on top of adding in a baby. So like that definitely helped with like staying consistent. So, the training sessions don't always look the same. Sometimes it's like, okay, I have, 20 minutes and I'm going to go really hard and that's all I can do. And then sometimes, I do have that full hour, 90 minutes where I can get a true like Olympic lifting like session in. And so I take what I can get when I can get it and keep it rolling.
Yeah, and a lot of times it seems like you're bringing her to the gym with you, which is fantastic, kind of paying forward and being a role model for the next generation, so to speak. And I know, at least from what we've talked about in the past, it seems like a lot of your training has revolved around Olympic weightlifting. So, for people who aren't familiar with the term, what exactly does that encompass, and what has your own kind of training looked like over the past few years?
Yeah, so Olympic weightlifting is a strength sport that is revolved around two lifts, the clean and jerk and the snatch. When you compete, those are the two lifts that you compete in. And obviously, with Olympic being in the name, it is a strength sport that is competed in at the Olympics. So each competitor, they will have 3 attempts at the snatch and then 3 attempts at the clean and jerk. And then whoever lifts the most weight wins. To answer your second part of the question, training wise, when I was doing more of a like strict Olympic weightlifting program, you would always have your main lift for the day. So that's some type of clean and jerk or snatch variation. And then there's typically a strength based movement in there, and then some other type of Olympic accessory lift. So whether that's, pulls or presses, obviously squats are a big part of that. And then there's always some type of like accessory movement block, which are, going to be more of your, auxiliary lifts. Yeah. So that, let's see, that would kind of be like my 4 day a week. Now things have shifted a little bit. And I want to say I probably get to do Olympic lifts, I would say twice a week. So I still try to stick to a 4 day training split. But with time restraints and things like that, I'll dedicate 2 days more to those Olympic lifting lifts and then find ways to build in my other strength based lifts on those other days. So that way it's not taking as much time, because a Olympic weightlifting session can really take anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours between warm up, you know, an actual proper warm up, and then warming up to your working weight in any one of the lifts that you're going to be working on that day, and then your accessory block. So finding ways to kind of take everything from my Olympic lifting training in the past and then blending it into a more conducive and time efficient manner has been really interesting. But I like how I have the split going for myself right now. I've still got a main compound lift in each day, and then I treat my Olympic weightlifting days as more of like a dynamic day.
I think it's so interesting how you transition from dance into Olympic lifting. Those are kind of different things in my mind. But I love the transition. I love the breakdown that you just gave. And I like how you mentioned, originally it was kind of more of like a 4 day split, which I see working well for the Olympic population. Now we're kind of hitting that 2 day split. On that note too, I like how you brought up the fact that this is a sport, it's competitive, and people are trying to be really good at it. I think a lot of times when people hear the term sport, they immediately think of something on a field or something on a court, and they kind of forget about things like Olympic lifting, strongman, powerlifting, and so on that way. And these are just as much of a sport, if not more than a sport, than some of the other things that people bring up a lot of times. I also love your point on the rest periods, because I used to kind of be the guy who was taking like maybe a minute in between sets. I was always kind of like, man, why are people taking so long in between sets? Why are they resting, 3 minutes, 5 minutes? And then I started to do more full body heavy compounds.
Mhm.
And then I realized, oh, this is why they
Yep.
rest so long. And I think it's kind of like that aha light bulb moment that you need to experience if you haven't yet. There's a huge difference in even something as simple like a barbell front squat compared to a full barbell clean and jerk, where you're getting the weight off the ground, you're exploding it up into a rack position, then front squatting and pressing it overhead all in one movement. There's certainly a difference in CNS demand, I guess we can call it. And the rest is a physical rest, but also a mental rest in my mind after the lift.
Oh, agreed, 100%. I think, you brought a good point with the, the power and the explosiveness that you have to have behind the lift. And so, think about your rest times when you're sprinting, when you're doing, plyos, and you're really working on power and what that demands. And now look at it as, okay, not only are you, you know, working off of all of that power, but now you're doing it under heavy amounts of load. And so those rest times are vital to be able to allow the body to have time to come back and hit another lift and then do it again and again and again, because you're not just going to do, 3 sets of a lift in a workout and call it a day. You're looking at from, your warm up weights all the way to your working sets. You could have anywhere from like 7 to 8 sets of, a complex that you're working through. And that's a lot for the body to be able to handle, especially as the load increases.
Definitely. And how do you go about breaking down? You mentioned that you do the main lifts and then you do Olympic accessories and so on that way. How do you go about breaking those down from a exercise selection and programming standpoint, right? Like what's the difference between, power clean, hang clean, clean and jerk, split jerk? Why would we choose one over the other? And where does your mind go from a programming standpoint around those things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, uh, it depends. And a lot of it is really athlete based. But I will say, there are there's an extensive number of variations that you can do for all of the lifts. You can work positionally, you can add in pauses, you can add in tempos and things like that. And all of those are considered different variations. So like even in a hang clean, you can do a high hang where you're coming more from the power position, or you can do, a traditional hang, which is going to come from like above the knee. But then as Olympic weightlifters, we also work a hang position from below the knee. So you're getting different positions that you can focus on throughout the entirety of the lift itself. And so depending on where the athlete may show weaknesses, those are the areas you're going to want to focus on. So one thing that I adopted from working with East Coast Gold, whenever we had a new lifter coming in the gym, and not even necessarily like new to lifting, but just new to the team, rather than calling it like an introductory program, we called it our acclimation program. And what we did was that program is designed to allow the athlete to come in and not only understand the verbiage of how we coach and what we're doing, but understand what each position of the lift actually is, what it feels like, what it looks like, and how you should move in and out of it. And then through that acclimation phase, so they're basically getting a chance to taste each of those variations from those different positions. And that also includes, doing a power clean, catching it in a power position, which is going to be catching it at 90 degrees of the hips and knees or higher, versus like catching it as a full lift and going into a full squat. And then through that, we're able to see, okay, this athlete is having a tough time when they are pulling the bar directly off the floor, if they're getting back behind the barbell, or they're having a tough time really driving from the power position. And then from there, in the next phase of programming, we can kind of choose some of those variations that are going to be more conducive to help them improve those weaknesses that we see in their lifts.
I love the concept of the acclimation period, and that's something that I think is missed a lot in programming, but being able to expand what I would call someone's movement vocabulary early on. And this is something we were talking, I think Nick Grano brought it up on a recent podcast about the 1x20 approach. 20 reps is kind of high for some of these Olympic lifts, but the concept of, hey, let's take a lot of different movements and just move through all of them and then kind of feel things out as we go, I think is really essential here. We were talking about this before we jumped on about how some lifters prefer to drive the bar off their thigh and some prefer to drive the bar off their hip. And I feel like you kind of need to experience the lifts to find out which kind of person you are as it comes to that. And on the same token, I've noticed a lot of people, especially when I go to different gyms, that do the Olympic lifts, but they don't really get that, bar touches thigh or hip and drive the bar off. They just kind of like brute force muscle it up, for lack of a better way to put it, which, I mean, I guess it works, but that's not necessarily the most efficient, effective bar path, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so it works, but it only works to a certain extent, right? There's going to be a threshold. You're going to hit a point where you can't just muscle the bar up, right? And so that's where the technique really comes into play. So, we'll have, new athletes will come in and they're like, oh, well, I can clean 300 pounds. That's awesome. That's fantastic. But why can't you clean more? And not to say, but like that, but that's because that's the sport, right? If this were a football player or a basketball player, like, hey, yeah, you can clean 300 pounds. That's great. Let's try to improve some of your technique. But like, that's not going to move the needle on the court or on the field. But if you're an Olympic weightlifter and you're competitive in the sport, like, hey, we want you to lift more than that. And so being able to understand and dial into the technique and why we do the things that we do allows the athlete to move more efficiently and create a better bar path, create a more vertical drive. And, kind of like to jump back with what you were saying about like the hip versus the thigh. In all honesty, that's really dependent on whether you're doing a clean versus doing a snatch. So you're going to have that wider grip on the barbell. So for a snatch, so your point of contact that you're going to make from the power position is going to be a little bit higher. It's going to be closer to that hip versus a clean where that barbell is going to make contact a little bit more mid thigh. So those little nuances, the same things are happening, but because of the width of the grip on the barbell, it's going to change where your power position actually is. And then from there, having a really tall athlete in a snatch grip versus a shorter athlete in a snatch grip, they're going to hold their hand placement on the bar in a different position. So that's also going to affect their point of contact. All of it plays a role. But the main guts of the technique, like we were talking about earlier, all really remains the same. You want to avoid the barbell kicking out away from you. You want to keep that barbell as close to the body as possible. We want to drive it up vertically rather than out away from us, because that's going to allow the force behind arm movement to allow us to move the barbell and then allow us to move ourselves around the barbell more efficiently.
I love that last part, how you broke that down, because the bar should almost feel weightless for a brief second when you do it, I think, right? Like the bar comes up in the air and you kind of almost scoop down underneath the bar. It's
Yep.
not so much lifting the bar up, it's almost getting the bar like thrown up in the air, for lack of a better way to put it, and then sliding underneath it very quickly.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So we call it, it's essentially, so in Olympic weightlifting, the way USAW teaches it is they go through the three phases of the pull: first pull, second pull, third pull. And that third pull is what you're referring to when you're coming underneath the barbell. And so where a lot of people, when they first start the Olympic lifts, when you look at it, you're like, oh, I need to yank this barbell up as high as possible. But in reality, yes, your arms are moving, your elbows are coming up to towards the ceiling and everything, to allow yourself the opportunity to get the barbell higher, but you're not really pulling on the barbell. You're pulling your body underneath the barbell. And so that's where that little bit of like weightlessness comes from, because from the point of contact to where you then drive into triple extension, that barbell is ascending. And then now your timing of it is to descend under the barbell as it's still rising. So that's where that weightlessness comes in. So that way you can meet the barbell and then kind of absorb that force as you come into that catch position.
Right. And in that catch position, we need to have a solid, what we call front rack position, in order to get the bar, hold the bar, and then obviously come back up with the bar. And that's an area that I find a lot of athletes really struggle with, whether they're Olympic weightlifting or maybe they're just, high school, college athletes and their strength coaches program cleans for various reasons. I've noticed a lot struggle when we get up here. Have you seen anything similar like that? And what kind of things do you typically work on to improve, and strengthen that front rack position?
Sure. So funny enough, a lot of athletes will come in and be like, "Oh, I have terrible wrist mobility and my wrists hurt, and that's why I can't get in this front rack, or my elbows hurt." And yeah, there are certain cases where that's a factor and that's a thing, but a lot of it honestly is a lack of T-spine mobility. And so the ability to be able to open up the chest and really retract the shoulder blades and engage the lats, and then externally rotate the shoulders at the same time to actually create what we call kind of like a shelf, right? So rather than being more narrow in that front rack position, you want to almost be opened up, so that way you're creating a shelf for that bar to rest on in that catch position. And when you can't get your elbows up and because your wrist is bothering you, you're not going to be able to open up as well. But a lot of that is really just stemming from the T-spine itself. And it's, we sit at a computer at school all day, and we're on our phone and we're hunched over. Just like with everything else with good posture, this is no different. That's going to play a factor in being able to create that good front rack position.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And not to mention, I feel like the T-spine being the only region of the spine that actually wraps all the way around and connects to the front of our body through some kind of bony articulation. And on that point as well, I think Chipper did some stuff on Instagram not too long ago about breathing and breath work and that sort of thing that way, and how that can play a role there as well. So there's a lot of different factors that go into that. From my angle, one of the things that I typically have gone to lately with decent success at improving that is I'll give people a kettlebell in each hand. And I know someone's going to listen to this and say, but wait, we're talking about Olympic lifting with barbells. Why are we going with kettlebells? But a kettlebell in each hand, and I have them tuck it in to kind of create that front rack position, build
Yep.
tension there, hold it, and then just carry it. And that has been a real game changer to actually get people to feel a solid front rack. And as you mentioned, that shelf type feeling, because a lot
Yep.
of people get in that position and they aren't really engaging anything. They're there, but they don't know what it actually feels like to create actual stability there.
Yep, exactly. And think about it, we got to walk before we run, right? Like just like somebody new coming into the gym, you're not necessarily going to have them back squat right away. Maybe you're going to have them do a goblet squat with a kettlebell. There's nothing that says that the same rules don't apply just because your sport is Olympic weightlifting and you have to use a barbell. Yeah, you're 100% going to use a barbell, but why not use other tools to be able to allow yourself to feel what those positions should feel like? So that way, when you grab a barbell, you're like, oh, yeah, this makes sense. And I know how to engage, my muscles to be able to hold and control this barbell because I've done it, from, I don't want to say a regressed, exercise, because I don't really see it as that, but I've done this with a kettlebell and I know how to control my body and that position and feel that tension. So now with a barbell and more load, I can do the same.
Yeah, once again, adding to our movement vocabulary, right? Taking other, training devices, for lack of a better way to put it, and getting in the same position, learning how to move there, learning how to stabilize there, and so on that way. And obviously, the kettlebells are great for that, but I know you guys have all kinds of different things in the garage. What kind
Oh
of
yeah.
things do you like to go and grab for the Olympic lifts that way as like an accessory or
I honestly, the landmine, I know that's like a Rude Rock staple. Like we love the landmine. But I think there's a lot of benefit to the landmine, especially from being able to press in different patterns and in different directions. Shoulder strength is a huge part of Olympic weightlifting. I know we've been talking about the clean a whole lot, but the snatch, you're catching the barbell from a deep squat in an overhead position. Like there's a lot of shoulder strength and stability that needs to come, in being able to perform that movement at a very high level. And so, the landmine is one for me where I like to take a lot of different, pressing variations and utilize that to just really build shoulder health overall to then be able to transfer it back to Olympic weightlifting. And similar, with the jerk, we're working on overhead mechanics as well. So the landmine is a big one. I really like using the tidal tank for a little bit more like oscillatory movements. And then I'll use the bamboo bar and throw some bands on it and do a lot of I like doing walking lunges overhead carries with it. Just kind of creating a little bit more, creating a need for the athlete to find more stability.
Yeah, I think that's such an essential element, especially with a joint like the shoulder, because that's an area that we commonly see injured due to
Yeah,
instability. I mean, it's one of the most mobile, if not the most mobile joint in the human body. And I think that this is an area typically, if I see Olympic lifters from a rehab side of things, it's usually some type of traumatic shoulder instability moment or some
yeah,
type of traumatic rotator cuff tear that is kind of associated with that
yep,
instability moment. So the more we can train resiliency in that position, I think the better off we are. I love your point on the bamboo bar. I love your point on the tidal tank as well, just to add a very different element to it. And I love the landmine as well. Typically, if I'm working with someone post-op for their shoulder, when I get to the time to introduce pressing or reintroduce pressing, I should say, the landmine is one of my go-tos and staples because there's so much variety and it seems to
yep,
be really well tolerated, even if someone's shoulder is a little bit cranky because it's more of an angled press as
yep.
opposed to a straight up press.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think the versatility to it, but and the ability for the athlete to be able to kind of like move with the landmine plays a big factor in that too, right? Because you're not in that, fixed position where that barbell is just going straight up overhead. The landmine is so mobile that they're able to find a way to get that pressing motion and work on that strength while they're still, recovering from an injury and rehabbing through all of that.
Yeah, definitely. And as you were talking there earlier as well, you brought up the snatch, and that's the other half of the Olympic weightlifting puzzle, I guess you can call it. And you mentioned about, wider grip position
Mm-hmm.
for the snatch than the clean. You mentioned about driving the bar up higher off of the hip than the thigh for the snatch. And you mentioned that typically for the snatch, we're looking at, coming all the way down into a full squat with the bar fully overhead. So I'd imagine that same concept of achieving that weightless, so to speak, bar feel is really essential here. If we've got to get the bar all the way up overhead as opposed to just halfway there into a front rack.
Yeah, absolutely. So weightlessness, sure, but also I think what it speaks to more is the speed of pulling under the bar, right? You're meeting the bar at a lower point. So when we meet the bar in the clean and we meet that barbell, we're meeting it where, our front rack is versus meeting it overhead in the snatch. So it's the difference between like a power and a full lift, right? So at a power, you're going to catch, your catch position is going to be higher, like we mentioned earlier. And so that the bar is going to be lighter in that regard because it's going to go a little bit higher so you can catch it higher, right? As the barbell gets heavier, it's not going to raise as high. And so your ability to be faster getting down underneath that barbell is going to be imperative. It's what's going to allow that weightlessness so that way you can receive the bar in a strong overhead position and you're there and you're ready for it rather than trying to, race before the barbell gets on its way back down. You want to meet it at its highest point, and so in order to still be able to meet it at its highest point, you've got to get those hips down fast underneath the barbell.
It's so interesting to me, the concept of lifting and Olympic weightlifting and getting underneath the bar quickly, because typically when we think about a powerful, explosive movement, and typically a lot of people credit the Olympic lifts for being great at developing power and explosiveness, we think about, athletes doing exercises where there's a really fast concentric or a rapid concentric arise. In this, it's almost reverse. It's we have to rapidly get underneath. So it's almost more of a rapid eccentric than a rapid concentric. And it's so
Mhm.
funny because I keep opening Instagram different times and seeing more and more people doing rapid eccentrics now, drop catches, and all these different things. So I think that there's almost like a little bit of a shift now into realizing that that rapid eccentric portion
Mhm.
holds a lot of potential value for us from a more global performance side of things, I guess I'll say.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think that there's a lot of value in it, and it's a lot of it's a different concept than what people have been, you know, kind of taught for so long. But if you look at, you know, even more traditional sports and things like that, you know, it's so unpredictable. And so being able to, you know, land properly from, you know, a layup in basketball, or, you know, um, you need the body needs that ability to eccentrically load and to be able to absorb the force in that. And if you can't absorb it fast enough, that's where we're going to have issues. And so being able to train that velocity in an eccentric manner is only going to help further just the athlete's overall ability to be able to tolerate variability.
And as we mentioned, Olympic lifts are a great way to do that. And I mentioned earlier that I see a lot of strength coaches programming these for their athletes, which I think is great. How do you go about on your side of things? Because as you mentioned, you know, you guys at Rude Rack are doing a lot on the injury restoration, you know, post rehab, return to performance type stuff that way. How do you go about integrating Olympic lifting components into what you do that way to kind of address or improve some of those more power and explosive type qualities?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. To be honest, I don't know if anybody is really looking at the Olympic lifts as like from that like restorative component. You know, obviously the Olympic lifters that I work with, and I know Jeremy has a couple as well, we're focused more on, you know, the Olympic lifts as their training, and then utilizing other accessory lifts to help them stay healthy. Whereas like a lot of the athletes that aren't traditional Olympic weightlifters that will use these lifts with, their it's more to focus on more of like a power component to help them improve, you know, their speed and their velocity, versus from like an injury restoration standpoint. And, you know, if we wanted to kind of like split hairs with it, I would say it would be more of those like dumbbell variations of a clean or a snatch that we would utilize for some more of those like injury, you know, specific cases.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point that way. And I guess it kind of becomes a matter too of like the lifts are great from the performance side, but if the lifting is your sport and you're already doing all of that, then
Mhm.
usually there's maybe a concept of addition by subtraction here, where it's like, hey, maybe instead of adding more Olympic lifting to someone who's already Olympic lifting, maybe we find other avenues to enhance that. And then,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, in some of those other sports athletes that way, that we see, using them to enhance different qualities that are missed, or, you know, as almost like a progression of training. You know, I think that a lot of these Olympic lifts can be complicated to learn, especially from a motor learning and motor pattern standpoint. As you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of steps. There can potentially be a lot of faults and a lot of cueing involved. So sometimes from a strength coach standpoint, you know, if I've got a team of 40, 50 people coming in and
Yeah.
40 of them have never cleaned, then it might be easier for me to use other variations or other exercises as opposed to the clean or as opposed to the snatch, just to kind of save a little time. Not to say that Olympic lifting is not valuable, but I also know a lot of these strength coaches are very pressed for the amount of time that they get with the athletes that they work with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm certainly never going to be the one that dies on, you know, the hill that like every athlete should Olympic lift and it's the only way to improve their power and explosiveness. Like that's just not true. I think it's incredibly valuable. I think it's a phenomenal tool to be able to help develop power in athletes. I think it has its place, but I also think that its place is really dependent on the situation and the circumstances. And I'll certainly be the first to tell, you know, anybody if you're seeing more value out of your athletes developing power through, you know, plyometrics and med balls and things like that, then do that, especially, you know, depending on how many kids are in the weight room, how much time you have, and how much experience they have with all of that. But I do feel like there are a lot of coaches that get so tied up with like it's just so difficult to coach. And the reality of it is that it's not. You can break down the movements to allow your athletes to find value in them. So like, you don't have to have everybody pulling from the floor. There is no reason why they can't perform, hang power clean and still be able to improve their power development and generate force from that. So that's another place where like a lot of those variations of the exercises come into play, where it doesn't have to be, okay, we're going to clean and jerk every single time, or we're going to full snatch every single time. There are so many other variations that you can do to help get the athletes under some load and to work to move that load.
Let's say you do want to integrate these movements with a team or, with a client that way. What's the best means to go about teaching someone how to do their first cleans, or how they go about doing their first snatch and that sort of thing? Where is kind of like a initial entry point and then a progression forward?
Yeah, so I like to work from top down. Some coaches like to work from bottom up, so meaning like working from the floor and coming up. I personally like to work from the top down. So starting with the power position, getting the athletes to understand what that power position should feel like, where their body should be, and how to move from that position. And then from there, work into that above knee position, below knee, and then get to the floor, and then breaking it down even further from the power position. Okay, we're just going to do a pull. So I want you to feel what it feels like to simply drive the bar vertically and hit triple extension. So we're breaking down the lift itself to allow the components of it to be mastered, to then put all of the pieces together.
Gotcha. I like that. So kind of taking the movement of the cleaner, the movement of the snatch, and saying, hey, here's step one, here's step two, here's step three. I think that stepwise approach is extremely valuable. This is also an area where I really love the PVC pipe or stick mobility, right? It's like we can go through the entire motion without the, quote unquote fear of load or the bar. And I find that if people can go through it fast and slow, and I think that's an essential piece too, is being able to go through the whole movement actually slow and controlled. I'm talking more specifically about the hinge and the squat portions, and then
Yeah.
obviously the press up overhead, making sure that we can actually control and be stable through the hinge, through the squat, and through the press is absolutely essential to me.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And like you mentioned too, with the PVC pipe and the mobility stick, it takes away that fear, especially in the snatch of, oh my God, I'm, have this heavy weight coming over my head. Am I going to be ready for it? Do I know what I'm doing? That takes away a lot of that fear. And so now you can focus on a lot of that speed and the timing of what the lift should feel like. Pull unders are another movement that I really like, and especially with the PVC pipe in the beginning, because you're just going from a standing position, and then you're working on that element of pulling yourself under the bar, and you're able to do it with so much speed because it's just a PVC pipe. But then you can kind of take that idea of speed, and then as load is applied to it, continue to improve the speed, knowing that you have the mechanics of the movement down.
Yeah, and you want every rep to look the same regardless of what weight is on the bar, correct? Like whether it's an unweighted bar or a super heavy bar, you're trying to do the exact same thing.
Yes, your 50 and 60% an empty barbell should look as clean and as precise as your 100% or your 90%, whatever you want to call it. There are a lot of athletes, for whatever reason, that are fixated on, oh, well, I can't move like this because I don't have enough weight on there. I can't do it this way because I don't have enough weight on there. And to me, that's so counterproductive, because if you can't do the simple things well, how are you going to do something when it's more complex? And in terms of this, like, if you can't do something when it's light, how do you expect to be able to perform that lift when it's at its heaviest? And now you're trying to not only remember your technique, but you're trying to, move this crazy amount of weight. Whereas if you're dialed into those lighter loads and focusing on the technique and the precision and making every single rep the same, which we all know in Olympic weightlifting is completely impossible, but that's the goal, is, to make the approach and positions and the movements that you're going through the same across all of your reps and your sets, then you're never going to see you're never really going to see any true progress, because when you get to those heavier weights, it's always just going to be grip, rip, and pray. And there's a point where like that's valuable, right? And sometimes you've got to turn your brain off and do it, but you get to that point by being able to do it so consistently across all of your warm-up weights to where you can actually turn your brain off loosely.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's an essential element. And on that note as well, I think a lot of times when I see people learning these things, they're often cued, and it's like almost 15 different cues for one movement. And I think this is an area where we can really over cue someone. And, we want movement integration or motor learning from repetition through the movement over and over and over again, but we don't necessarily always need 15 cues to accomplish that.
No, that honestly, that is the worst thing that I do, because now your athlete is fixated on, okay, I need to have my hand here and I need to breathe and I need to pull and be in this position and, drive vertically and rip the bar, get under the bar, elbows up, body down. Like there are so many different cues that you can tell your athletes, and they're valuable, but there comes a point where they become invaluable because now the athlete doesn't actually know what to focus on and what to work to improve. And so they're just trying a million different things and they're never able to actually build any kind of consistency. So like there are a million things that you can probably change about a lifter, especially a new lifter that's just learning the lifts. And there are so many different things that you can tell them. But the biggest thing as a coach that you should know is that there should be just one or two things. And a lot of times cueing those one or two mishaps is going to clean up a lot of other things along the way. It's like one of the big things that we see is like weight distribution. So where the weight should be distributed across your foot, like the big emphasis in Olympic weightlifting is mid-foot, right? We should feel pressure through the whole foot on the floor, but your weight is centered across the middle of your foot. And what we see a lot of people is they'll shift back into their heels and then they have to roll into their toes. And so it's going to create this ripple effect of issues as the lift goes on. So focusing on that allows you to then clean up, the ability to drive the bar more vertically because you're not swaying back into the heels to then have to come forward into the toes, which will probably kick the barbell out off of the hips and send it out in front of you rather than sending it upward. So finding those one or two cues that are specific to the athlete and that are going to help kind of clean up a lot of those other details is really where it needs to be. And then the other element to that is letting your athletes know that, right? Because a lot of times with Olympic weightlifters, you'll tell your athlete, hey, this is what we're working on today. And then they'll do, that correction in the lift, but then they'll be like, oh, but I didn't do this part right. No, maybe not, but the part that we were focused on and the goal that we had for today and the technique that we were trying to hone in on and improve upon, you did that. So now we can consistently continue to do that over the course of, however many weeks until that becomes ingrained. And then we can move on to the next element. And again, as they're continuing to improve that one facet of their technique in the lift, over those couple weeks, it's going to clean up other things as well. So there doesn't need to be 15 cues. There can always be a million things. And I guarantee you, like the Olympic lifters at the highest level will tell you 10 different things that they can do to improve their lifts at any given point in time. And they're about to be on the Olympic stage. So like newer lifters and, more novice lifters coming into the gym, like, it's okay. It's never going to be perfect, no matter how long you've been in the sport, but finding the facets of the technique that stand out the most, that need to be fixed, and dialing in on that, that's what's going to lead you to success.
I think that was a great breakdown, Nicole. I love the way you kind of broke through that. And as you mentioned, it's all about kind of tackling like the big rocks in the jar of training, for lack of a better way to put it. I think a lot of times we get so caught up with those little minute details that may or may not make a huge difference. One of my favorite cases, not too long ago, I had someone come in and they were like, "Yeah, I just feel like I have an asymmetry." I was like, "Well, your sport is something that's going to develop an asymmetry, right? Like you use one side, you don't use the other." But we tested and there was like a 5% difference side to side, right limb versus left limb. And it's like, everyone's got something like that. Just because we have some small little things that we could improve upon doesn't mean
Mhm.
that we really need to spend a ton of time on those little things. There's much bigger things, like you mentioned, about the importance of the midfoot load. And in my head, I'm like, thinking to myself, that's why so many people wear specific shoes for Olympic weightlifting that are different
Yep.
than, say, your Hokas or your running shoes or whatever that way. Like, there's a reason we have a shoe for this kind of sport compared to a different sport that way. So I think that focusing on the big things, the things that are really going to make the difference and move the needle forward here for the athletes in the Olympic weightlifting space is absolutely essential, because if you get so lost in those little things, then you end up in that like analysis by paralysis state where it's like, oh my gosh, there's so many little things to address. When in reality, it's like, no, we can still train around this. It's just, we have to be aware that there's always room to improve.
Yep. Agreed. 100%. And it's, I think Danny does a good job with his analogy with that too. It's like, okay, well, how much of a separation is there from, the floor to the ceiling? And rather than continuing to raise the ceiling, we're elevating the floor to be able to close that gap without just, completely feeling like we're broken and we're beaten down, and this is just a huge thing. It's like, well, is it, is it really a issue to have that 5% difference? Is it causing a problem in what you're doing, or is that simply, how your body has developed over time and now you're actually using it to your advantage in your sport?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I feel like we've covered a lot of different ground as it relates to Olympic weightlifting today, from the clean to the snatch to accessories and so many other great points along the lines of the sport. Is there anything that we missed or anything else that you wanted to bring up in relation to Olympic lifting today, Nicole?
One thing that I will say, and it sparked my, it popped into my head when you were talking earlier about, um, the Olympic lifts, and that, being the sport itself, and just constantly like beating down, doing those same lifts over and over again, because that's the sport that it demands. And so the way that I kind of look at it is, for Olympic lifters, a lot of times they get so siloed into the fact that, like, in order to get better in the snatch and the clean and jerk, I have to snatch and clean and jerk. And that's true. You have to do the lifts in order to get better. But the same way a football player has football practice and then they go into the weight room to get stronger, in Olympic weightlifting, you're in the weight room for your sport. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be other accessory movements and lifts that you shouldn't be doing, because you want to look at it as like your Olympic weightlifting training is your football practice, right? But then what else can you do in the weight room to improve that as well? And I think that kind of leads me into my like second point. I think that Olympic athletes should absolutely train rotation. I think that's something that doesn't really necessarily get talked about a whole lot. And uh, I think it's something that can help with their longevity and their robustness and their ability to, again, tolerate variability and being able to move heavy loads and be able to catch and stabilize those heavy loads. I feel like people get so fixated on the fact that, like, well, we just need to squat and we need to pull. And I feel like there are a lot of things that can be added into a program without taking away from that can really benefit athletes.
I completely agree. I love that point. Adding in the ability to produce and resist rotational forces throughout the entire body, to me, that just adds a whole new layer of stability that we really need, right? In order to squat down, like you were talking about, we need rotation at the hip. So if
Yeah.
we can't produce rotation and resist rotation, then,
Yeah.
we have a, potential spot or fault within that squat pattern that we should probably address. And again,
Yeah.
accessories are a great place to do this. I don't have
Mhm.
to make my whole workout rotation based, but there's
Right.
certainly a time and place for it. I love your point on the rotational side, and I think this is also an area too, where I always plug isometrics. I think isometrics can make a huge difference here. It's like,
Agree.
someone's having a hard time in, the whole of the squat or in the front rack position. Why not just ISO hold that position and
Mhm.
build strength, build, our body's ability to kind of self-organize and stabilize in that position.
Yeah.
And I guess I've got to bring this up at this point. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on machines for for Olympic weightlifting, because I've noticed a lot of Olympic weightlifters are very barbell heavy, but
Mhm.
I've started to notice myself more and more that maybe machines actually have a place in training for certain individuals that way.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it goes back to just kind of like that old school training of Olympic weightlifting, like all you need are plates and a barbell, right? And so that has just carried over for decades and decades to where it's like, okay, well, this is the only equipment that we need, and this is what we're working with, and this is what we're going to do. And I think that, depending on what the athletes have access to, I there's no reason to not incorporate it in. If nothing else, it allows you to continue to work to strengthen a muscle or an area of the body without having to have so much load and so much time under tension, right? Like if we're looking at, um a quad extension, we're going to be able to work the quad muscles without having to beat it down with heavy loads of a back squat again. So we're just getting, we're able to train those muscles in a slightly different way to kind of minimize some of that overload that we get from doing the Olympic lifts over and over and over again.
Yeah, no, definitely. I love that point. Nicole, for people who want to find out more about you, or maybe they want to check out Rude Rock, where can they find you all at?
Yeah, so our website is ruderockstrength.com. And then we also have a extensive YouTube library where you can find a ton of just, webinars and exercise content. And that is, Rude Rock Strength again is our YouTube channel. And then for me, I'm on Instagram at Nick Marie, Nick_Marie. But yeah, YouTube, Instagram, website. You can always send us a DM. Our Rude Rock Instagram is Rude Rock Strength. So we make it pretty simple to find us. Rude Rock Strength. Google
Yeah.
it and we pop up.
And you've been pumping out all kinds of content lately. As you mentioned, you've got all kinds of video libraries. I know you've got so many different, different things like assessing the fascia lines and different hands out that way. You've got your programming, you've got your online courses to kind of dive deep into that fascia world. You guys do so many different things, and we'll make sure to link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch any of that, you can, look into it more there. Nicole, I really appreciate your time and for everything you guys are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.